Right. Of course, thank you for inviting me. I'm really pretty much excited to be able to share with you basically the theoretical framework and also some results, empirical results of my research here. So I prepared around 45-minute long lecture, if you want, and then of course there will be hopefully time for discussion. I hope the PowerPoint will be working. We had some kind of troubles before, but now seems to be working. So I will try to scroll the slides and just tell me in case it doesn't work. I know this is a seminar on methodologies, and one of the questions actually we are trying to address over here in Erfurt is to wonder whether our approach to urban religion is actually a method as the status of a method, or it's something less, something like a heuristical or analytical framework for deep in understanding and shedding light on old issues or like already researched issues. So maybe this can also be a matter of debate. I mean, to what extent is this a method or something else? Anyway, I'll start. The title of my lecture is an outspoken playful plagiarism of Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents. And likewise, the history of my developing spatial critical approach the historical study of urban religion can be said to have started with a plagiarism. But what is a plagiarism, and is it so bad? There is a French philosopher I like very much. His name is Guy Debord. In one of his famous essays called A User's Guide to Détournement, Debord quotes another French, a poet he liked very much, and his name is Isidore Lucien Ducasse, also known as Comte de Lautréamont. In one of his only two works, The Songs of Maldoror, Lautréamont draws extensively on yet another French, a naturalist this time called Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon. I don't know how much Lautréamont liked Buffon, nor whom Buffon in turn possibly drew. They don't say it, it's not really important. But Buffon was a real Comte, while Lautréamont's same title was part of a pseudonym, a nom de plume. And taken all together, Comte de Lautréamont is a sophisticated compound plagiarism made of a quotation of a title character of Eugène Sue's Gothic novel Lautréamont and an allusion to the Le Comte de Monte Cristo by Dumas. For Ducasse, indeed, poaching was a form of art and plagiarism was a personal brand. According to Debord, indeed, all the songs of Maldoror of Lautréamont are a masterpiece of plagiarism in that they are, I quote, one vast détournement of plagiarism of Buffon and other works of natural history, among other things. Ultimately, Maldoror is about a massive hijacking of Buffon and other writers by a 22-year-old poet who once wrote, and I quote, "Plagiarism is necessary. Progress demands it. Staying close to another phrasing, plagiarism exploits its expression, erases false ideas, and replaces them with correct ideas." End of quote. Now, for both Lautréamont and Debord, plagiarism is a most parasitic literary device and at the same time, a most progressive and corrective technique. Plagiarism is illuminating precisely because it's parasitic. Plagiarism, for Debord, is also a democratic and even revolutionary device, but this is not the story we're talking today. Today, I'm telling you the story of a little plagiarism that I made. A plagiarism, I hope, might turn out to be as epistemically progressive and as methodologically correct as Debord and Lautréamont wanted to be. So the first part of this lecture sketches out the little story of my plagiarism of certification, while the second is a brief demonstration of the value of this category, which means that the first part will be more theoretical and focus on contemporary questions of urbanity and religion, while the second will be on a particular case on Roman religions, which is my domain of specialization, which is early Christ religion. So to start, I hope you can see the slides change in my, okay, that's good. So certification was born between 1987 and 1999 by two fathers or two male genitors. One is the US-American political theorist Murray Bookchin, and the other is the US-American historian and scholar of religion Robert Orsi. I said two fathers because as a noun and a technical term, certification appears only in Bookchin. In his 1987 book, The Rise of Urbanization and the Decline of Citizenship, Bookchin uses certification extensively with a programmatic intent, and yet somehow he got it wrong. Or better, he employed certification in a veiled-laden and idiosyncratic, unpromising fashion that has limited its future prospects. The coinage indeed goes almost unnoticed. The coinage, Orsi instead, in his 1999 introduction, Collective Volume Gods of the City, never used the substantive certification, but only twice the adjectival participial form of the verb citify, which is citified. Nobody noticed this usage either, but Gods of the City, especially thanks to Orsi's introductory essay, has sparked a whole thriving field of study that spans human geography, the social science, and finally also the religious studies. This field is the field of urban religion. As what follows will show, Orsi, when using citified, contrary to Bookchin, somehow got it right. So all in all, my certification is a plagiarism because it parasitizes Bookchin's certification by rerouting its sense in a way that departs completely from Bookchin's aim and rather overlaps with Orsi's use of citified. So to say, from Bookchin, I steal only the signifier, all the rest is erased. Instead, my certification stays close to and exploits Orsi's citified by trying to erase some false ideas on its meaning and potential uses and replace them with correct ideas. As remember, plagiarism is necessary, progress demands it, and this lecture is about the possible methodological advancement and prospective paths of analysis that certification can offer to the historical study of ancient Roman religions. So, according to some online English dictionaries, to citify means to become urban, to conform to an urban environment, to adopt the customs and habits of city people. In its active sense, the verb means to cause the urban becoming, that is, to impart to something or somebody the style of a city. Persons are citified when they get too close, when they were too sophisticated for associating again with their village folks. A way of talking becomes citified as a consequence of the speaker's immersion in an urban setting. Small towns area can get citified by the opening of an avant-garde cinema, an international bookshop, or a McDonald's. Even the style of governance of a democracy can be citified as a consequence of the mayor-like attitudes and populist tendencies of its prime minister. The guy on the right is the Italian former prime minister Matteo Renzi, who was before the mayor of Florence and liked to be called the mayor of Italy. So citifying the charge of prime ministers. So two things can immediately be noted from these two examples. The first is that when is it applied to human beings or human skills or man-made environments or institutions, citified always implies an urban influence and sometimes presupposes some priming urban experiences. Yet it does not demand a city as a necessary arrival point or geographical physical setting of the citified entity. For instance, I can keep on talking like a Parisien, also once returned to my Norman village. Or by the same token, the new franchise shop does not turn the English hamlet into a city. In short, citification is not coterminous or coextensive with the city. Second point, certification has more to do with the range of urbanity than with the size of a city. For instance, Erfurt. It's a way bigger than Tübingen, Siena, or Santiago de Compostela. But its small student population, weak cosmopolitan complexion, flat nightlife, and boring weekend sociability might make its overall human and non-human atmosphere less citified than smaller cities. In a nutshell, citification does not measure the city, but rather measures urbanity. So, unsurprisingly, among the things that are particularly prone to get citified are people's consumption habits, which means fashion, tastes, and all sorts of advertising-induced needs. And here it's where Robert Orsi's use of citified steps in. It's only in the early 1930s, says Orsi, that American, so also global popular culture became irrevocably citified. Advertising, which became a New York industry in the 1920s, stimulated citified desire across the land. End of quote. Now, in Orsi's 80-page long introduction to Gods of the City, citified occurs only in this passage. Besides, none of the authors contributing to this important edited volume further use this term. If anything, they use the more simple urbanized. For instance, when Kara McCarthy Brown describes the voodoo practicing Haitians moving to New York City, she says that these people came to the United States already quite urbanized and Americanized. She explained, in fact, that in most cases, their grandparents had already left the Haitian countryside to move to Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti. And it's there in Port-au-Prince that their grandchildren, the future migrants, got exposed to American way of life and culture. So the arrival of these third-generation Haitians, to New York, says McCarthy Brown, simply turns up the volume and intensifies this urbanizing process. So as a behavioral descriptor, in this case, urbanites fits in very well because implies always a city, whether New York or Port-au-Prince, as a rival point of this spatial transnational movement that in the course of 3 generations has turned several non-urban Haitians into urban New Yorkers. And yet I believe that Orsi's sporadic use of the form citified that you find on the left of the slide in relation to American popular culture and advertising-induced desires indicates a rather different phenomenon. Citified is not a mere synonym of urbanized. When discussing this kind of cross-class spread of commercial imaginaries, Orsi presumably employs citified for a reason. The reason is that such process has involved US citizens and residents within American cities as well and as much as it invaded American small towns and countryside. In other terms, American city dwellers stayed urban and American country people remained rural-based. And nevertheless, via the urban advertising industry, they both became increasingly citified. So in Orsi's view, urbanity clearly traverses the city boundary, reaches out to the countryside, encroach on and shape more and more differentiated human lives, aspiration, habits, and settlement patterns. Again, certification is ultimately about urbanity, not the city. And urbanity is something that travels out without its paramount material expression, the city, coming along with it or necessarily sprawling. So housing the media industry, New York City, cities like New York, are at the beginning of the flow of the Americans' citified desires, not necessarily at its ends. A confirmation of what I'm saying can be found in another fragment of Orsi's introduction. A few pages before the passage quoted above, Orsi employs the negative form, de-citify. The verb occurs in relation to some pastoralization campaigns organized by secular and religious organizations from the early 90s to the 20th century. And Orsi says, and I quote, among the motivation for this impulse to de-citify urban population was simply the wish to provide some relief from the oppressive physical condition of city life. The use of the word, end of quote, the use of the word clearly follows the same logic. Orsi explains that only in some cases, but definitely not as a rule, these de-citifying cures designed to heal the spiritual decay and physical distress of these urbanites required them to be sent out to farms and ranches. In short, just as citifying trends do not necessarily draw people into city, de-citifying agendas do not need to push them back to the countryside. The US urbanites targeted by these campaigns were mostly de-citified in situ, which means in their own cities. They were not de-urbanized, or at least not necessarily. So it should be clear that, however legible and even clearly marked out, the border of a city past and present cities does not tell where the effects of urbanity stop. Therefore, an investigation on cityfied behaviors, including religious behaviors, must not attempt to develop criteria for distinguishing between originally or exclusively urban and rural religious practices. So instead of dictating the topographical terms of the inquiry, such a perspective rather invites to start with the notion of a city without compellingly equating the fieldwork with a city frame. And let alone adopting what the urban sociologist Hilary Angelo calls a city lens. What is a city lens? According to Angelo, a city lens is a lens that carves up spatial and social difference in binary terms, country, city, and it delineates the geographical space of the city against a non-urban outside, and assigns a variety of normatively laden and polarized social signifiers to each location. So the city lens that divided the word into country and city brings about other sort of chain of social signifiers like nature, society, agrarian, industrial, community anonymity, or narrow-mindedness, progressiveness, so on and so forth. So the notion of certification not only allows to expand the geographical reach of the research beyond the city space. It also invites to look at phenomena observable in the city, including religion in the city, by doing away with a folk understanding of the city and of the country, of course. Now let's move a bit closer to religion, which is our topic. So like a person, a religion migrating with and through its worshippers to a foreign city can be more or less urbanized in symbols, narratives, practices, and institutions. Consider again the case of McCarthy Brown's study of the Haitians serving the spirits in their living quarters in Brooklyn. In this essay, we read about voodoo priestesses hauling a garbage pail full of earth up to their apartment on the 37th floor of a low-income building in Brooklyn. Or, like the ingenious Mama Lola that you can find on the bottom left, who is the protagonist of McCarthy Brown's monography, deciding to pour the libation into several small bottles and parceling them out to devotees who will directly wash their bodies with it. So in all these cases, voodoo can be said to be urbanized, in that, due to the transportation of the ritual setting, the traditional contact with the Haitian earth in its pristine agricultural cult has got lost. So people with migration background feeding the spirits, for instance, on a parquet floor or through the skin of the bodies in a bath tubes, have certainly and self-reflective urbanized the Haitian voodoo. Yet my point is that such a refashioned voodoo can be equally be said cityfied, in that, it's not hard to see voodoo in New York stretching and straining to accommodate new and often alien spaces. Most of this strain is felt at the level of ecological distance, a lack of natural harmony between the religion and its adopted socio-ecological niche. Ceremony condenses and twists itself around to accommodate to the more confining spaces of New York. Some dimensions of voodoo symbol system become attenuated, distant, others intensify and undergo greater embellishment. End of quote. So whatever its origins, I would say that a cityfied religious symbol system is one that must creatively stretch and strain to accommodate the urban space in ways that are largely contingent upon the characteristic of a city-state at a given time and the social existential trajectory of the practitioners. So in the case of voodoo, the ethnographer says that most of the strain is felt at the level of ecological dissonance, yet not all the strain. And here lies the second main aspect of certification as an humanity-related descriptor of religious change. One can be, for instance, a Santeria practicing Puerto Rican immigrant in New York, or a second-generation Italian-American in Harlem, or a homegrown conservative evangelical in London, or why not, a Roman early Christ believer in ancient Rome. These people biographies, means, strategies, and outcomes cannot be more different, and yet the cityfication formula is the same for all of them. Fooled by aspiration, cityfied religious practices are such as to appropriate bits and strips of city activities, places, and rhythms that would otherwise remain anonymous or indefinitely other. And in doing so, cityfied religious practices also produce religious change. What I'm suggesting is that whatever spatial practice we decide to identify as religion can be cityfied by both adopting and adapting to city features. And I also argue that describing these urban religious affairs as cityfied rather than urbanized would be explanatorily much more useful, in that it would help us to shift the focus from the quest of the geographical origins and provenance of a cult or some practitioners to the analysis of some distinctive quality of transformative religious practices that can be as different, and I quote from Orsi, as different as turning apartments into abattoir, or basing of housing projects into venues of the spirits, into penitential pilgrimage routes, city water flows into receptacles for sins of the resting places of Hindu gods, and intersecting street corners into vectors of spiritual power. So, like religion in general, urban religion too is about making homes and cutting boundaries. To quote the famous title of a monograph by Thomas Tweed, urban religion is about dwelling, that is, worshipping in an apartment, for instance, as much as about crossing. For instance, turning the apartment into something else, into an abattoir, for instance. Yet what is distinctive of what I call cityfied religious experience and practices is the way and the extent to which the strategies, the practitioner strategies of inhabiting and transcending these spaces are shaped by the options and the limits that themselves of other phases in organizing their livings in urban environment. And here come the intellectual plagiarism from Orsi, that is my own definition of citification. This is the definition, and I quote it. Citification of religion refers to the processes whereby differently empowered agents across the social spectrum carry out religious actions that succeed in appropriating city spaces, at least for some time, in relation to a certain audience and in a manner that engages with the urban quality of their context at a particular moment in the history. So what is urban religion? Then a scholarly evaluation and decision based on the observation of different instances of citification, urban religion is the name given to the temporal accumulation of such processes that produce, in turn, new urban space. So methodologically, this approach helps us to shift the focus from religious as an explanans to religion as an explanandum. In other words, citification is somehow inviting us to see whether and how many characteristics that we generally consider as aspect inherent, intrinsic to a given religion, or even to religion to core, are actually the outcome of specific of an action on spaces on the parts of religious agents. And in this sense, turning now to my own case study of a particular Roman religion, I would like to show that citification of Christ's religion speaks more of the context-specific urbanities of the early Christians than of the distinctive qualities of a emergent Christianity. And seen from this perspective, the latter, so the emergent Christianity, is rather what comes out of the former. So, having said that, I would like to use the second part of this talk for a particular purpose. I've decided for this seminar not to detail here the research program of my almost complete habilitation monograph, whose title is the one you find on top, Citifying Jesus, the Making of an Urban Religion in the Roman Empire. So what I do in this book is to leverage the just mentioned definition of citification and all that comes beyond in terms of theoretical framework to identify and expose 10 trajectories of citification of Christ's religion in this case, that span a period of almost 4 centuries, which means from Paul to Augustine, and touch on different cities along the Mediterranean, under, of course, the Roman rule. Now, each of these trajectory constitutes a chapter of the book, and each chapter focuses thematically on one or on a set of specific urban features as enabling or constraining factors that contributed to shape Christ's religion as an urban religion. And the focus of the book chapters are urban religious themes as heterogeneous as the different facets of urbanity that they intersect. And the list contains production and management of built space in the city. It's one chapter, one topic. Then the problem of spatial fragmentation and isolation in cities. The question of housing and neighborhood life. The topic of the street network and street encounters. The issues of publicity, discretion, and secrecies and sociological kind of relationship in the city. The topic of spectacularization, so outstanding visibility in, for instance, mass environment, literate practice and the bookish culture in cities, the question of ranking and unranking of powers, the carving of urban imaginaries, and the participation of people to the construction of the city, which is called participation to the urban earth. And among my strongest intellectual allies are sociologists like Georg Simmel and Erving Goffman, geographers like David Harvey and Jacques Lévy, philosophers like Henri Lefebvre, Guy Debord, and Hélène Leuillet, urbanists like Jane Jacobs and Kevin Lynch, archaeologists like Karen Crumley, and of course, religious scholars like Jörg Rübke and urban historians like Susanne Rao, who are the two spokespersons of the Erfurt Research Project. So now, the reason why I don't want to concentrate today on the contents of this book, which means on none of these 10 trajectories of citification, is because I have the clear feeling that the whole stability of this whole construction ultimately depends on the possibility or capacity to challenge one particular type of radical criticism. And then I would like to take the opportunity of this last minutes to show that eventually this kind of criticism is premised on a misleading argument. The criticism runs like this. The idea of urbanity is an unwarranted principle and factor of religious change in general, and in Mediterranean antiquity in particular. Thereby, urban religion is an unjustifiable anachronism at best, a chimera at worst. In either case, it is an unforgivable error for a scholar of ancient religions. Therefore, instead of delving into the contents of citification, I will address the discontents with citification. Now, in his methodological contribution to a recent collective volume, which is this one, called Early Christian Encounters with Town and Countryside, Essays on Urban and Rural Structures of Early Christianity, which I think came out in 2020. The Dutch historians Frits Gerald Narebot challenged the widespread scholarly assumption that, and I quote, Christianity was from the days of its formation a primarily urban phenomenon. Arguing with unquestionable energy, clarity, and consistency, Narebot carries out his critique on 3 levels. First, he starts with a demographical argument. He says that given the eminently rural complexion of the Asian Mediterranean world, urban Christ believers could not have outnumbered the rural ones. Therefore, in order for the oft-repeated statistic and figures on the growth of Christianity to make arithmetically sense, a much greater rural dimension of the movement is to be factored in than the one traditionally assumed. So, demographic argument. But then there is also, he makes a contextual point. In light of their symbiotic ecologies, the town and the countryside are to be considered complementary and conjoined, rather than opposed to and divorced from each other. And then he strikes also a etiological blow, a causal blow. Noticeable difference among Christian communities are not contingent upon their urban or rural characters. spatial determinants, so to say, do not matter, or if they matter very little. Now, according to me, the first point is totally sound, and I have no objection to it. However parametrical at best and conjectural at worst, circulating figures on the number of the rural Christians must be revised. The second point, the contextual point, is agreed as well. As said, and I repeat, citification and in consequence urban religion are about traveling religions and boundary crossing and boundary blurring urbanities, not about bordered cities and compartmentalized religions. And the fact that Narabout credits the Erfurt-based research group with, he said, the acceptance of the urban-rural dichotomy, I think it's simply a matter of misunderstanding or lack of clarity, let's say, from our side. So the first point is accepted, the second is accepted as well. The third one, instead, is definitely the most challenging. Because the third point directly targets of the causal dimension of the relationship between urbanity and religion by questioning the urban as the distinct factor of religious change. And so I will focus on this last argument because it is also the point where Narabout extends his criticism to the legitimacy of the very notion of urban religion that we are developing. And I quote, "Religion will have been a creative force from before the rise of the city, and was such a force subsequently in urban and non-urban contexts. It can be studied as such in the context of town life in the ancient world, but I do not think that this context, as town life is part of city life, which also embraces the rural, turned it into a phenomenon sui generis, urban religion." End of quote. Now, I would like you to pay attention to the wording. Religion is said to be a creative force, whereas the city is nothing but a contextual signifier, an inoperative container. Religion generates things, while the city just contains stuff. A shortened for the resources managed and the strategies pursued by religious specialists and practitioners, religion acts and propels changes, whereas the city merely houses and records them, or, if anything, symbolizes them. And I think it's always kind of striking to note how, for scholars of religion, a personified type of agency is admitted for religion only. Religion is unquestionably assumed to operate as a creative force, while for some reason other panhuman kinds of phenomena like the city do not have the same prerogative. Now, of course, the question is, can a social natural assemblage like the city act agentically, have the same agency as human beings do? Of course not. No one ever went as far as to claim that, not even Henri Lefebvre and the most radical among the Lefebvrean acolytes in urban sociology and spatial theory. And yet, instead of delving the critical, crucial theoretical distinction between causal relationship, so making things happening, and enabling relationship, so making things possible, and that's clarifying that the city as a spatial formation entails the latter more than the former, I would pursue a more empirical approach to this issue. In fact, if one were able to find an early rural-based variant of early Christ religion that shows character significantly influenced by its interland conditions, then the sui generis quality of urban religion can indirectly come to the fore and be substantiated. In brief, we need a case-contrast studies. And it turned out that we have it. This case is called the Phrygian sect by its rivals. It's called prophecy or new prophecy by its adherents, but scholars mostly Montanism. Now, what is Montanism? Originated in West Central Phrygia, probably in the area which is now the Turkish province of Uşak, sometime during the latter half of the 2nd century, This particular version of Christ's religion is described as follows by one of its major contemporary specialists, who is the German scholar Heidrun Elisabeth Mader. And I quote, "The prophetic movement in Phrygia is one of our first examples of rural Christianity, evidenced not only by epigraphic but also literary sources. We saw how the Phrygian Christians could practice their religion with more interreligious outgoingness and more freedom due to the hinterland conditions. Compared to urban settings, they were farther away from strict imperial observation. Beside the inscription and the iconography on their doorstep, the content of the oracles, composed by both women and men, displayed their religious self-consciousness. So did the ecstatic form of uttering them and writing them down, thereby producing religious literature. While profiting from the freedom the hinterland offered, these rural Christians also suffered from the lack of protection provided by city walls and imperial control over collectors of illegal dues. Montanus, who is the founder of the movement, Montanus' oracles show how the Phrygian Christians compensate for their tribulation theologically. Their tenacious belief in an ideal celestial Jerusalem city coming down onto their own settlements illustrates in a lovely way how these rural Christians dreamed of urban advantages cleansed from the urban disadvantages that would have curtailed their religious freedom." End of quote. Now, in this insightful essay, which paradoxically appear in the same edited volume that includes Nerebaut's methodological contribution, I think that Mader deploys an explanatory model of urbanity, plurality, that focus on a very limited and thus controllable set of opposition, and does so without any distorting city lens, producing dichotomous stereotypes. So what she does, she observed an outburst of ecstatic outgoingness and epigraphic self-confidence in early 3rd century Phrygian Christianity, including the Montanist version of Christianity. Then she plays out a contrast between a rural interreligious openness and lack of strict political control on the one hand, and an urban, more cautionary approach of coming out Christians in dense and more pervasively monitored urban environments on the other. And finally, she assumes that the rural Phrygian Montanist epigraphic habits and forms of prophetic utterances are likely to instantiate this difference. So in short, rural Phrygian Montanist epigraphic habits and forms of prophetic utterance are traits bespeaking a rural religion. One has to note that throughout her essay, Mader continually speaks of the Phrygian Montanist as exponent of a rural Christianity. And besides, contrary to Nerebaut, she does claim that rurality significantly shapes the Montanist religious identification strategies, group styles, and even literary expressions. Yet it is to note that she's not arguing that Montanism is a rural product only possible under rural conditions. Nor does she assume that urban Montanists are like a contradiction in terms. Quite the contrary. We know that the spread of the movement and the recruitment of new adherents were largely dependent on traveling texts and human mobility via interurban networks. To mention just one example, the Christian African writer Tertullian is known to have adhered to the new prophecy in the midst of one of the biggest and most cosmopolitan cities of the Roman Empire, Carthage, where Montanism was possibly introduced from the very capital of the empire, Rome. Likewise, Mader does not claim that coming out Christian was impossible in cities, of course, or that rural freedom was unconditioned, generalized, and limitlessly creative. In and outside academia, every member of a deviant group or potentially stigmatizable category of people knows this is not true. But in my view, Mader's essay beautifully shows that it's not Montanism, understood as a derogatory appellation of an empirical phenomenon, that is a rural religion. Rather, it is rural religion as an intellectual construct that can help explain some particular aspects of original Montanism. And at the same time, is likely to use up or modify its explanatory power when the new prophecy works its way into cities as different as Antioch, Rome, Lyon, Carthage, and later on also Constantinople. Now, if the documentation allowed it, potentialities and limits of the citification of the new prophecy would definitely be a topic worth exploring as the opposite case. So this the potentialities and limits of the rurification of an originally urban religious constellation, tradition, movement, and so on. Yet equally interesting for my purpose are Mather's very final reflection on the urban character of the compensatory imagination of the Montanist. And I quote again. She writes, Montanus' oracles show how the Phrygian Christian compensated for the tribulation theologically. Their tenacious belief in an ideal celestial Jerusalem city coming down onto their own settlements illustrates in a lively way how this rural Christian dreamed of urban advantages cleansed from the urban disadvantages that would have curtailed the religious freedom. Now, rural Phrygia was poor, and at the time, as inscriptional evidence show, its agricultural population was suffering under high fiscal pressure. It seems in particular that tax collectors combing the country on behalf of the imperial procurators were especially given a free rein in overcharging tenant farmers who worked on the vast imperial estates that stretch all over the birthplace of the prophetic movement. So in 3rd century Phrygia, Stadtluft macht frei. The aerial city makes free, at least when it came to the extra dues imposed by tax collectors' bullying. In contrast with farming settlers, walled-in urban population, since their inception probably, are at the same time caged and protected. Now, unsurprisingly then, the apocalyptic reward imagined by the leaders of this originally rural-based religious movement takes the form of a city. Not just of some random city, though, but of a specific city of the Judeo-Christian apocalyptic discourse, the heavenly Jerusalem, the city. And referring to the supposed climax of the Montanist apocalyptic imagination, Mather writes that heavenly city comes down onto rural polis and onto imperial farm estates. Now, the name of these rural polis, actually our small town and a farming settlement, respectively, are called Pepuzza and Timion, which Montanus himself first seemed to have identified with no less than Jerusalem. Now, whether this eschatological myth of a Judean celestial city descending into a Phrygian plateau actually belongs to the earliest phases of the movement or dates some generation later is a matter of debate for specialists, but not a virulent impediment to our argument. For instance, it's true that Tertullian does not mention this myth. But is this because the fabrication of this oracle is posterior to Tertullian's early 3rd century adherence to the new prophecy? Or shall we think that Tertullian simply passed over the apocalyptic exaltation of an unknown rural location far away from both the political core of the empire and the geographical cradle of Christ's religion, and was largely insignificant to its urban audience in Carthage? If the latter is the case, then we would have an example of citification operating through silencing and embarrassing rurality. However, this hypothesis is way too far conjectural. So I will conclude by focusing on this imposing image of a rurally displaced Jerusalem to show how, methodologically, it can offer a quite illuminative example of what citification is and how it functions. So on the one hand, we see urbanity outside the city coalescing in a powerful ideal. We observe urban aspiration of protection, comfort, and liberation very different from the above-mentioned rural dimension of security and freedom, crystallizing in a dream. The dream of a set of urban advantages that travel out of the city, land on a vast agricultural tableland stretching between two small Phrygian settlements, and thus transform for good and for the better the countryside and the city life and the country life. And all this while leaving behind the disadvantages related to practicing Christ's religion in an urban environment. On the other hand, we see urban religion beyond the city appearing as a utopian religion. So we observe citification in the form of a religious program that capitalizes on the symbolic content of a specific urban referent, Jerusalem, a powerful signifier, which is all the more free as the real Jerusalem had been recently renamed to Aelia Capitolina, and which is as place unbound as it is transposable and transferable to a host of different localities, including Phrygian small towns and rural areas. In a word, with this myth-making, we have seen urbanity outreaching its paramount material expression, the city. And we also have seen a distinct type of citification, technically a cityscaping, bringing urbanity to bear on the country people's religious imagery of cosmic upheaval. We got a further corollary insight, though. This magnificent Jerusalem cityscape in 3rd century rural Phrygia showed that the citification of Christ's religion in this very specific spatio-temporal context and very specific domain of apocalyptic imagination seems to know no ecological dissonance. What I mean, that contrary to the citification of rural Haitian voodoo in contemporary American metropolis, the transplanting of the Holy City onto an extensive rural plateau is not such as to put a heavy strain on the prophets. And this not only because, as some scholars have argued, the most recently identified location of Pepuzza and Timion is topographically very appropriate to host a sudden apocalyptic urbanizing events. And certainly not because the Phrygian spokespersons and other ends of new prophecy perceive no difference between the city and the countryside, but because the change of the social ecological environment, in this case, made no difference in the myth-making association between the triumph of urbanity and the cosmic victory. Just like urban philosophers such as Philo of Alexandria, urban missionaries like Paul of Tarsus, and anti-urban prophets like John the Seer, the Phrygian farming peasants too aspired to live eternally in a paradise city. To conclude, the example of the Phrygian Christians shows that contrary to a spontaneous misunderstanding of both notions, urban and rural religion do not index distinct religious topographies, nor do they designate different religious entities or subsequent states of a single religious movement or organization. Rather, urban and rural religion may refer to the synchronous coexistence within a specific religious constellation of ideas and practices, of assumption, aspiration, and actions that relate respectively to urbanity and to rurality. And citification is the name given to the multifarious processes that lead this assumption, this aspiration, and this action to their urban, permanent or reversible, ephemeral or resilient accomplishments. Thank you for your attention.